Next, we have our first panel discussion for gridXdays, and we'll be talking about how we can ensure a sustainable and socially just recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, and more generally about how we can guarantee a fair and equitable global climate action. Taking part in the panel today, we have Tristan Foerster, who has been the co-CEO of ClimatePartner for over a decade, supporting companies in their commitment to fight global warming. ClimatePartner aims to enable a climate-neutral product in every shopping cart. Before this, Tristan gained experience in strategy consulting at Roland Berger and founded several digital companies. Thanks for joining us today, Tristan.
Thank you very much, Greta. Happy to be here.
Great. And as you can see, alongside Tristan, we also have Dr. Barbara Saerbeck, who works as a project manager for key questions at Agora Energiewende, focusing on the electricity grid, buildings, and the transition to sustainable heating. Previously, she analysed the German electricity, gas, and heat markets at the Federation of German Consumer Advocacy Organisation. Thank you for joining us, Barbara.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Thomas Flochel, who is a senior energy economist at the World Bank, joining us today from Washington. He has a PhD in economics and currently leads SMAP's utilities for the Energy Transition Program and supports team projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and Latin America, advising utilities and regulators on the deployment of renewables and digital technologies. He also leads World Bank investment projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Thank you for joining us, Thomas.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, so taking away our first question, Tristan. As the world struggles to overcome many of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, is it possible to align economic recovery with the net zero pathway?
Absolutely, Greta. I do believe so. It's what we've been experiencing with our customers in the past, especially customers coming from, let's say, essential economies that were actually quite thriving during the pandemic, that somehow the pandemic has initiated a change of thinking also towards climate action. That it's showing that a lot of large businesses in the food, retail, consumer goods area are actually stepping on the gas to take climate action and actually to come out of this pandemic much stronger and much greener. We see it in, of course, other industries that were hit by the pandemic quite strongly, like, let's say, travel industry, airline industries. That's going to be a little bit more difficult because as soon as people travel again, the emissions will go up straight away. But the awareness is there, the willingness is there. And I think it comes a bit from the topic about the pandemic. The pandemic has shown that we can only solve this worldwide problem as in a collaborative way across the world, with different countries working together to solve a problem that did not have a solution at the beginning. And this same thing accounts for climate change, because climate change will be the much higher impact than the pandemic has given in the past 24 months, and then we see. So we have to solve this problem of climate change together as a global effort. And maybe it's a proof from the pandemic we can solve global problems, that we take this along in our minds to solve global problems with climate change together as well.
And Barbara, what do you think will be the key tools or levers to enable an aligned recovery?
I do agree with you, Tristan, that it's a really way to fasten the green Energiewende, so to speak, and it's possible to do so because, let's face it, even before COVID, like 2019, the world was already hurtling towards the climate crisis. So I do think one has to look at the short and long-term goals, and see it as a possibility and an opportunity to launch a clean industry transition for one. As an example. So it is the time to accelerate renewable investments as a way of breaking out of a series of European impasses. If you look at the European context, for example, and to stay with the European example, like as an historic EU budget of 1.8 something trillion euro, and this offers plenty of opportunities for green investments into the power, transport, building, and industrial sectors. And so, of course, you have to make sure that it's not only short term, but that the money actually goes into renewable energy, smart grids, and energy efficient projects around the world.
And Thomas, what's your take on the matter? Can you provide any examples of where countries have successfully achieved an aligned recovery?
Thanks, Greta. I wanted to come back on the kind of the initial question, and I really like what the other panelists said. But I think, the challenges posed by COVID are really hard to overestimate. I mean, back a year ago, the World Bank forecast that the global economy would shrink about 5.2%. It would be the deepest recession since the Second World War. And job loss has been immense. Billions of jobs have been under threat, with 4 out of 5 people in the global workforce affected by full or partial workplace closures. And obviously there's been the huge health costs and personal loss. So this is given rise to a huge financial stimulus to build back better, as we say, after COVID. And given the nature of the crisis, I think these packages have had to focus on building resilience and on job creation. And in line with your question, I think, yes, it is possible to align this recovery with the net zero pathway. And in fact, there's been a lot of debate about how to build back better and greener. And so, on the levers, I think that there's some very interesting research that was done by Oxford University, looking at 400 different kind of stimulus packages post the 2009 crisis. And they identified 5 types of policies and packages that could really help to deal with these crises. There were, clean physical infrastructure investments, building efficiency spending, education training investments, natural capital investments, and then clean R&D spending. And to come to examples, taking from the developing world, because that's where we work at a lot with our clients are at the World Bank. And I wanted to take Morocco as an example. The government has been investing in projects that target the creation of a sustainable ecosystem, and that really maximizes the positive impact of the projects in the region. And that, I think, is really what the post-COVID recovery has taught us, is that every project that is proposed will have to be evaluated on its capacity to develop this, this sustainable ecosystem, build the jobs, and provide also R&D investments and human resources, so that these projects can then provide sustainable development and growth. And in Morocco, for example, the development of the Noor solar plant, with the creation of Mazen, which is now a reference in the regional international scene for renewable energies, and which was supported by the World Bank at the time to develop this through supporting them with concessional financing. This has really been an example of a type of project that can not only develop these kinds of growth, but also develop the skills and the expertise to engender sustainable growth for the economy.
Thanks, Thomas. And Tristan, can you provide any examples of where companies have enabled simultaneous economic growth and sustainable action?
Well, great. If you look at it economically, and that's assessed by indices, for example, like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, you can actually see it in the numbers that businesses who take sustainability seriously and really implement it into their DNA as a company, these companies are more successful building capital and building revenues and actually top line and bottom line as well, more profits. And these are ranked also, and you can really see that on indices like this Dow Jones Sustainability Index. The big question is, what is cause and effect here? Maybe these more successful companies generally just do more sustainability in a successful way as well. So it's not so very clear to be more successful that you're sustainable, or the other way around. Generally, we see it by several companies, no matter if they're small, medium-sized companies or if they're larger companies. A lot are investing into the sustainability sector. And if you look at consumer goods, that's something that people can grab and it's more tangible. You see that the demand is there. So businesses are realizing if they're not able to deliver sustainable and climate-friendly solutions to consumers, they will miss out. So it's now a competition on sustainable goods and climate-friendly goods. So you see the shelves of retail stores filling with organic products, with vegan products, with the vegetable aisles are getting larger and larger. So you really see that the consumers are asking for this and are really opening their arms for this new sustainable sustainable products. And if you turn that around, it means if you are more successful in actually taking climate change seriously, adapting to climate change, reducing your energy consumption, being more efficient, turning to green energy, and actually changing the way you produce products and what kind of products you produce, that will be rewarded by the market. And that's what we're definitely seeing a shift taking place in. And the ones that are leading the sustainability shift in this climate action shift are definitely, we see them being more successful than other companies.
Thanks, Tristan. And Barbara, what do you think can we learn from this, specifically in relation to the COVID recovery? Can we use it as an opportunity rather than a challenge?
Yes, we should use it as an opportunity, and we can do it. As Tristan and Thomas just pointed out, it's a huge chance for us to turn it around, so to speak, and to make sure that we combat climate change in a way. Just as an addition to Tristan, for example, in Germany, the German car industry is really eager for the German government to push the goal even further in order to, find a market, get the electricity mobility going and to set an example, so to speak. And in other countries, for example, there's a study from the Climate Policy Initiative and the Seoul National University analyzing COVID-19 recovery policies in South Korea and Indonesia. And they find for South Korea that it was able to address both economic and climate concerns through fiscal stimulus packages. And these policies and projects proposed in South Korea can be largely grouped into three categories. For example, the first one would be transitioning buildings and infrastructure into green. Secondly, the expansion of low carbon and distributed energy. And third, the green industrial innovation. So as you asked, what can we learn from this? It is possible. We need to take action, and we can take action, but make sure that we include specific targets, timelines, sectoral pathways, or plans to reduce emissions and stimulate economic recovery. And we more of a need to put specific attention to the given. We need to put emphasis on creating enabling environments that attract private investments in the green transition plan, while also relieving the pressure on public spending.
And yeah, exactly on that line of introducing emissions targets, Thomas, how fair do you think it is that countries have different emissions targets? And what needs to be taken into account? For example, level of development, available resources, proportion of emissions, to ensure that the targets are really fair?
Greta, that's a thorny question in some of these. I mean, look, I think it's unrealistic to expect otherwise. Countries are starting from different emissions levels and will have different constraints related to their emission targets. I mean, if you just take the energy sector, which is the sector I'm from. In terms of priorities for climate-focused action, they'll depend on the country context. So in high-emitting middle-income countries, key steps might include, retiring coal-fired power plants, replacing fossil fuels across the economy, removing market barriers for green technologies, and all of that while maintaining a just transition, so compensating potential losers and segments of society that might be worse off from this. For lower income countries, I think we're still working to provide energy access to all, and it's crucial that they invest in low carbon baseload capacity and renewable energy in order to provide for this. So Yeah, it's important, I think, to realize also that the bulk of the growth in global emissions in the coming decades is set to come from emerging and developing countries as they grow and industrialize and urbanize. So the trick is really to help those countries that have not yet built in these high emitting technologies to instead invest in cleaner technologies and thereby, help them to be able to achieve more ambitious emission targets.
Mm-hmm. And we've just had a few questions from the audience. Tristan, in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, environmental reporting has a weight of just 3%. Should this be more emphasised?
Absolutely. I believe that, and that's what's happening at the moment. If we're looking at ESG criteria, those are criteria by which investments can be taken in a sustainable way. So environmental, social, and governance criteria that make part of an investment decision. And these ESG criteria are growing as we're seeing this happening. And the partition of these ESG criteria is also growing. So, and then that will be absolutely necessary to steer capital into the right areas. If you're only looking at criterion of profitability on your investments, but not on sustainability, you may make short-term windfall profits. Yes. But we have to set up a system or adhere to a system that you actually make long-term profits. And you see what's happening at the moment in different legislations, which is quite interesting and very surprising for me, actually. First indication that we had was that the family, the Rockefeller family, main shareholders of ExxonMobil, actually sued ExxonMobil for not accounting for climate change risks in the business. Because they know if the business doesn't change, they will go out of business very, very soon, whilst strongly harming the climate. Second thing that's happened also in the UK in the Netherlands, is that Royal Dutch Shell has been sued by environmentalists that they are not ambitious enough about their climate actions that they're taking. And they won. So Shell had a fairly low target on reducing climate emissions over the next couple of years, coming up, I think, till, don't quote me here, but I think something till 2030, they were only about 15 to 20% reductions of emissions. And said, no, that you can't do that because you are postponing the risk into future generations. You're not taking responsibility, and you're part of actually the responsibility of contributing to climate change. And so, yes, it is absolutely necessary, not only in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, but also in other indices to include these environmental risks and these climate change risks into their assessment. And the interesting thing is it's happening because the investors themselves are noticing, because companies like large pension funds, insurance companies, reinsurance companies, they have huge amounts of capital that they need to assess, that they don't assess short term, they assess them long term. And they need to make sure that this investment that they take has a long-term return. And you can only do that if you know that you're investing into a decarbonized assets. So it's happening. And I'm absolutely, I say yes, that's the right question to ask.
And in line with that, so you're saying that you're really seeing a change in the last few years. The movement is kind of picking up pace. One viewer asked, ClimatePartner's been around for quite some time, and now it's really picking up. How does it feel for you for that to be such a trend now and for it to really becoming kind of top of mind for a lot of people?
It's exhilarating, absolutely. We've been around for more than 15 years, and we've been, let's put it this way, we're a for-profit company because that's just the way we want to work with other businesses together. But to be honest, the first 9 years, we were an involuntary non-profit company. So it really took a long time what we do is we enable other businesses to take climate action, just to put it simply. And just at the beginning, nobody wanted to. Nobody thought it was necessary. It was something for environmentalists, something for businesses, some family businesses that said, oh, I want to be a sustainable business, but it wasn't for the big ones. It wasn't until really, honestly, a 16-year girl took to the streets that things changed. And that was 2018 when your name cousin, or how you want to put it, Greta, took to the streets and started a movement with Fridays for Future. And I tell you a short experience I had. That was about, say, 6 years ago. I was invited to a trade fair to tell about a story of how businesses can take climate action. It was a huge trade fair in London. And honestly, 4 people appeared. And the one person was the organizer, the second person was the camera person, and the other 2 were 2 tourists who got lost and wanted to rest their feet. So, and I still held the presentation because I said, I'm here anyway. I'll just practice and I'll tell the story another time. Then I got invited to one of the largest e-commerce conferences in Berlin in 2019. So a year after Greta had taken to the streets, and I got a whole hour to tell the same story of how do businesses take climate action in the right way. And I was really nervous because I thought nobody's going to be coming again. It was like 5 minutes to start, and I had a room that fit 50 people. And after 70 people, they closed the doors and said no more, rien ne va plus, because it was full of people. And I said, what's happening here? And I held my speech. And then at the end, a gentleman got up and said, I'd like to contribute something. Why am I here? And I looked around and I saw there's all decision maker level people and entrepreneurs, managers. And he said, well, I'm here because last week, Thursday, I was sitting at the supper table with my, amongst others, 13-year-old daughter, who told me, Daddy, I'm going on strike tomorrow to strike for climate action. And he says, no, young lady, you're going to school. And she then got up and told him off a half an hour straight. And he said, okay, young lady, you convinced me, you can go on strike, and I'm going to go listen to this speech by ClimatePartner next week. And that's when I realized the room was filled with 70 parents. And parents are decision makers. And this is what happened. The children really changed the world and really changed the awareness for climate action. And this is why we're sitting together here. Otherwise, I'm afraid nobody would be listening to us. And this got into the boardrooms, it got into the media, it gets into the minds of society. And that's what changed also then for the businesses that notice they must take climate action because they now actually believe it's the right thing to do, but also especially because their stakeholders believe it's the right thing to do, their investors, their customers, and their competitors. And that's what's really giving an uplift to the whole topic. And I'm really grateful to be in the situation we are today. To be speaking to so many people wanting to take action.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I love the idea of being name cousins with Greta Thunberg. Now, Barbara, does fossil fuel divestment really benefit the community?
Meaning in which way?
This was from the audience, so we will have to just interpret that how we will.
I think, but it's... let me put it this way, let's start what Tristan just said. Actually, the German Constitutional Court recently pointed out that Germany needs to make a stronger effort to guarantee the right of future generations to an intact environment. And I think that's an interesting turn of events, as we 2 months ago or 3 months ago, we still were speaking about, is it possible to be climate neutral by 2050? How should we do that? And now it's not, is it possible, but let's do it and let's actually get down to business, and make it work, make it happen. So I think that's really good that, as you said, it's like the future generations coming up and saying, hey, we have a right to a clean and intact environment is really pushing the agenda forward. And so, of course, the revenues, like probably climate, maybe I related to carbon pricing. Yes, it needs to be diverted to other parts or structures. For example, as carbon pricing harnesses the power of private actors in changing their production, consumption, and investment decision. And therefore, it can play a central role in a broader strategy for cost-optimized mitigation efforts. But that said, one needs to carefully look at each country in order to make sure carbon prices have an effect. that they are not, just there's a carbon price and nothing happens because it's too low. For example, for the German context, one solution could be to use the carbon price to decrease the German Renewable Energy Act levy, like the EEG-Umlage. I hope I got it right, to furthermore decrease the German electricity prices, as electricity will be the main power source which will be used in the future across sector, as I said earlier on, like in the mobility sector, even in the building sector, so on. So lowering electricity prices will benefit all. But currently in Germany, to stay with this example, like the CO2 price lays with the tenant, and there's no split because the government decided against it. So what I want to say is one needs to fairly distribute costs and benefits while also resolving the so-called landlord-tenant dilemma. That, if I pay the CO2 price, while as tenant, I cannot do as much as the landlord could do in order to, decrease my CO2 share. For example, I cannot make the landlord change the heating system and so on. So I think we carefully must speak about, how to how to get the CO price, how to, get it back to the people, or provide incentives for people who can actually make a change, so they might make a change.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you. And Thomas, speaking of carbon pricing and making it socially just, do we need to redistribute carbon pricing revenues to ensure that it is socially just, or are there other methods?
Thanks, Greta. Yes, I mean the short answer is absolutely we need to redistribute revenues from carbon pricing. I think it's important to realize that the energy transition is not just a technology and an economic transition, but it's a very political one. And any failure to recognize that would, result in huge backlash, as it has, in fact, in some countries. So, and I think our politicians are very aware of that. But what is important to get a measure of is the scale of investment that will be needed to help this transition happen in some countries, and particularly those countries that have invested a lot in highly emitting industries that are dependent on coal, for example, in the energy sector. The economic impacts of the transition tend to be very concentrated on certain communities that could entirely lose not only their jobs, but their whole livelihood and in fact, the whole community itself. So measuring the scale of investment that will be needed at the public level, but also, from private investors to help operate that transition and create jobs for the people who are going to lose out from this. As well as the social safety nets that need to be in place to be able to help people during this transition is something that I think is very key. And in the developing country context, it's brought together some very different lines of work with governments that focusing purely on sort of energy sector issues and social protection. And we're realizing more and more that one of the key drivers of resilience in countries is the ability to weather shocks and to help poorer communities weather those shocks. And so a key part of this climate, the energy transition and the transition to a greener economies is to help these governments develop social safety nets that they can use to shelter populations that will be affected by either by climate shocks or by the energy transition itself. So yes, in long, that is, I believe, an essential part of the question.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you mind if I add to this carbon pricing?
Absolutely.
Because I think a lot of people aren't quite aware what carbon pricing actually means. It's like a topic that you always read in the news is what is carbon pricing and what's happening right now, let's say in Europe on carbon pricing. We have two systems in Europe that are steering, or they're supposed to be steering investments into renewable energies, for example, like Barbara was talking about. The one system is for high energy businesses. They have to take part in a cap and trade system. So you have carbon emissions of 100% today. You are being forced by law to reduce these carbon emissions year on year. At the moment, it's about by 7.6% per year, so that we can get to net zero by 2050, which we need to get to. So if you produce more carbon emissions than you're allowed to, you have to buy carbon emission allowances through the stock market. So that forces you to spend money on something you don't want to spend money on. So it wants to force you to invest to reduce your carbon footprint. If you're better at reducing your carbon footprint than what you're allowed to sell these rights. And that's the carbon trading scheme that high energy companies have to take place in. I believe this scheme should be broadened to all businesses out there, because that's something where you directly have to change the way you do business, the way you produce products, in order to force you to reduce your carbon emissions. A second model is carbon pricing. And carbon pricing is nothing but I'm putting a tax on fossil fuels that I'm buying, that I'm purchasing. It gets more expensive. So it's more expensive to buy a liter of diesel. It gets more expensive to buy a liter of heating oil, like Barbara says, for people living in homes. It also gets more expensive for the diesel that you need as a business to run your cars. But it's only on the topic of where you're burning fossil fuels, right? The problem is, though, that you're directly, with the carbon price, directly impacting consumers directly. Because if in Germany, the commute is an average of 40 kilometers per day, people are driving their cars to their workplaces. So they're going to be directly affected by carbon pricing, and they have to pay more. Does that lead the automotive industry to switch to electric vehicles? Does it lead to utility companies building up infrastructure for electricity that's green? Not really. So it's actually really strongly impacting consumers in the end. Also in businesses, but businesses, they can transform. Can my 60-year-old mother, can she transform, buy a new car, electric vehicle? No, not right now. So this is what we have to help with, and there's two ways to do this. There's one way that just keep the system up, just to do it for everybody, but then pay back people that are in need, that cannot afford the higher carbon price, but need to get to work. And that's something, for example, our Green Party is thinking about how to do this. But that makes it really complex. So I would rather have a system that forces businesses to change than a system that forces consumers to change, but that they can't, where they don't have a choice to change at the beginning.
Yeah, it's really...
If I can even come back, I mean, and then we can move on, but I completely agree with Tristan. I think we've seen in many sectors that, in fact, regulation is very much of the most efficient tool to operate rapid change at the business level and at the production level, and that can then create a new standard that the industry can follow and consumers can follow to that. You know, bringing in just the developing country perspective, and the reason I was talking about social safety nets, many countries, because they don't have that ability to target assistance to the poor, use very inefficient tools to do that, such as subsidies for energy, for fossil fuels. So we're talking about a carbon price, which in some countries is where we're at, but there are many countries in the world where fossil fuels and carbon is subsidized. And it's subsidized because the government doesn't have the means to provide other methods of assistance to its population. And therefore, they resort to these highly inefficient and highly, environmentally destructive measures. So, yeah, just wanted to... And
in line with that, Thomas, what responsibility do developed nations have to support developing nations. For example, at the G7 recently, the nations reaffirmed their goal to contribute $100 billion a year to climate finance for poorer countries, but this target wasn't met for the previous goal of 2020, in part due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think this support is realistic and or enough?
Another thorny question. Greta, I think, the part of this question is the kind of a cornerstone of the international climate architecture is the principle of, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which was inscribed in the 92 UN Climate Convention. And it's a very well established principle of international law. The idea that countries that have contributed more to climate change will need to contribute to it, to solving it more. I think there's also the fact that three players are really responsible for about 70 to 75% of global emissions here: the US, China, and the EU. So I think it makes sense to look at the cumulative actions of those particular actors and maybe plus India. But when it comes to the financing needs for supporting poorer economies in their transition, no, $100 billion a year will by far not cut it. I mean, before going down that route, and I think it's important to say that meaningful climate action does require scaling up of finance. But that this climate finance that is being pledged can really leverage much larger amount of financing from the private sector if it is deployed in a strategic way to de-risk some strategic investments in renewable energies and these kinds of projects. So this 100 billion can be used to leverage far more financing into the right sectors. But to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, we estimate that developing countries alone will need about $4 trillion per year in investments up to 2030 to build infrastructure to meet their development needs in a way that is sustainable and that is in line with climate goals.
Wow, okay, very interesting. And Barbara, you've done some research on the mechanisms to enhance state and non-state actors' ability to influence policy making. Can you tell us a bit about what you found?
Well, as I said, the fiscal stimulus packages, to make sure that the money goes where it needs to go and make sure that it's into green investments and not support a sector or an instrument which is, where we know it's not working in the long run as it will be phased out anyway. Short term or long term, for example, coming back to the heating sector, what this kind of the questions you were asking, looking, how can we, the tenant owner dilemma, how could they, maybe, for example, have look at the how we pay rent, for example. In Germany right now, it's that we pay rent to the landlord, and then we also pay the electricity bill as well as for heating. And one concept could be to just change the system in a way that we say, okay, the landlord has to pay for heating as well, for him to get an incentive to change the heating system as a whole. That's said though, but we cannot leave the landlord by himself. As living in a big city such as Berlin or in other cities, the landlord hardly has a chance to really look into, or has a chance but not the opportunity to change the heating system just on its own, as he cannot build in a heat pump if the building is not made for this or there's not enough space to do so. So actually, it's for the country, or at the local level, it is necessary to have communal, local district areas, or different mapping of different strategies to show where will be an area where heating pumps, or the heating district could be Fernwärme. I'm just missing the word for it. Exactly and then to make sure that there's a concept behind it, because investments into the building sector are long term, which means if I now change the system decide for a new heating system, I will, the next time I have to decide on a new heating system will be in 20, 30 years, even if I'm lucky, even more years. And so we today have to make the right decisions in order to stimulate change. So in 20, 30 years, we will not have the problem, we will not have the problem and make informed decisions now. And then that means also that not only the local level or the governmental level needs to, work on plans and communicate plans and what they envision for the cities or areas in general, but also, the landlords and tenants and everybody else needs to, like the industry and local stores and shops need to know what's coming, so they're able to react to it. So I think honesty is really a big point in this entire debate to let the people know, it's coming and it's really important. But we have to make a change. We want to make it as just as possible. But we need to. It's everybody needs to tune in, and not only in Germany, but also worldwide. It's not one country against the other, but like everybody, it's not a race against the different countries, but a race against time. So we all need to make a cumulative effort to share the burden and to make sure it's a green recovery strategy.
And speaking of strategy, we've just heard a question from the audience. Tristan, do we need different strategies for different sectors? And if so, how can we find the right strategy? CO2 reduction parts.
Pardon me?
In terms of, CO2 reduction.
Yes, for CO2 reduction, emissions reductions. The answer is a simple one. Yes, we do need different strategies for different sectors because it depends how you cut the sectors. If you're looking at the energy producing sector, it goes more along what Barbara was just saying. We have to find a way to shift over to completely renewable energy, and how to get this renewable energy also to the place of where do I produce it and how do I get it to where it's going to be used. So investing in grids, investing in production of renewable energy. If you're looking at the agricultural sector, we have a completely different carbon emissions problem, and that's things like working the land and having actually livestock causes a lot of carbon emissions in itself by methane production and other greenhouse gases apart from CO2. So there's a whole that's a real scientific issue and problem that we have to solve. And then you have by different sector. If you look at the travel industry, how do I make travel green? And so you're looking at the aviation sector that is looking into how do I actually produce kerosene in an organic and a carbon neutral way? Is there a possibility to do so? And then you have producing sectors where you're also talking a lot about renewable energies and talking about collaborating across multiple supply chains. Because if you're selling, let's say, a shirt here in Germany, this typical shirt has 11 tiers of supply chain steps of production for this simple product spread across the whole world. So how do I actually get collaboration into these globally networked supply chains in order to reduce carbon emissions along every single step? And the overall topic that is then for all industries to look at, and that's where we need collaboration across territories and industries, is in the end, by 2045, 2050, we will not yet be able to produce emissions free. So even if we are very, very optimistic about technology developing, which I am, there is exponential development coming. In the end, we will still have a carbon footprint left. And that's why we're always talking about net zero. In the end, we have to reduce through technology and investments as far as we can. But in the end, we'll still have, let's say, 20 to 30% of carbon emissions left of today's carbon emissions base. And we have to get this. How do we get this carbon emissions that we still produce? How do we get that sequestered, so taken out of the atmosphere in order to move forward? And that's where we all have to work on technology solutions there as well, because nature-based solutions, unfortunately, will not be enough. We'd love to be able to reforest all across the globe in order to have a nature-based solution to sequester carbon completely, because that's would be the best thing to do. But unfortunately, it's not enough yet. So we have to also steer investment into this kind of carbon sink technologies as well. And that's where we all have to collaborate.
And owning in a little bit more directly on the energy industry, Thomas, it's clear that we need more renewable power installation. How can we best enable this?
Yeah, thanks, Greta. Look, I mean, and kind of following up a little bit on Tristan, what Tristan was saying, and on that question. Yes, we need huge amounts of renewable energy investments in order to start decarbonizing the power sector. How to best enable this? Well, it depends a little bit on the context, obviously. So in some countries, renewable energy is, as a technology in itself, already the least cost solution for generation. But variable renewable energy to integrate, solar or wind onto the grid will require some grid investments in order to be able to manage a grid with more variable renewable power. So one of the ways in which we can help increase the investments in renewable energy is for public investment to go into reinforcing the grid and in order to allow it to be able to accommodate more flexibility resources. How do you do that? It can be through investments in transmission, or it can be through battery storage, and in fact also in relying more on distributed renewables in across your grid. And finally, also in investments in digitalization of grids, which can allow utilities to better appreciate and modulate demand and supply to ensure they're always in balance, following the variability of generation from renewables. So that's really on the kind of investment side into the grids themselves. I think beyond that, in a lot of countries, investments are still limited by the risk factor that exists there, and so what the World Bank Group does in general is to provide also some financing to try and de-risk some of these projects, providing some grant money or some guarantees to reduce political risk or other sort of off-taker risks. In a lot of emerging economies, utilities are still rather financially fragile, and so cannot act as credible off-takers for renewable energy IPP projects. And so several financial mechanisms exist to backstop some of these payments. And in the longer run, working to help these utilities institutions become more financially viable and the sector more financially sound, and by reviewing, improving the efficiency of the utility, reviewing tariffs so that they can reach cost recovery, allowing these utilities to then get back to financial viability, is also a key factor in enabling these renewable energy IPP projects to come online. And then finally, I think there's an aspect that we always forget, which is the human aspect of this, and that goes both in investing in training and capacity building in a lot of countries where there is still not yet necessarily the understanding of how these renewables can be integrated into the grid and how to operate a grid with more, higher range of renewables. But it also comes on the consumer side. And in fact, for in the off-grid sector in Africa, for example, a lot of work has gone into educating consumers about the quality of different systems, but also about the fact that they can actually rely on having a solar home system rather than needing a connection to the grid. I think that applies across the board also. So yeah, I mean, investments in the grid and in how to operate the grid, to build more flexibility to take on more variable renewables. I think financing instruments to de-risk investments, investing in institutions and in the utilities to help them come back into financial viability and be credible off-takers. And then finally, the human aspect and investing in that capacity building. Those are a few kind of areas, I think.
Thanks, Thomas. And another viewer has asked, simply hoping for change won't do enough. Barbara, how do you think we can ensure global climate action reaches the goals that we need to within the necessary timescale?
Thank you. I do believe too, it's not only, we need more than hope. Of course, we need hope to make sure that it works, but we need to make sure that the countries follow their pledges, especially COP26 coming up in Glasgow this November, like a conference of parties of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, to make sure that they meet the goals they actually pledged like a couple of years ago, or they're discussing right now. That said, and they, for example, money-wise, we just mentioned it already, like the United Nations has estimated that there needs to be $2.5 trillion for a rescue package, and even more, that this is needed to help the world's emerging economies cope with the pandemic and its consequences. And as we discussed earlier today, make sure it goes into clean and green investments. So financial stimulus, and also make sure that they, follow suit and have like timelines, etc. All the things I already mentioned. But for example, I want to take an example. For example, Turkey, like the European Green Deal. There's like the EU plans to impose a carbon border tax on imports. But the EU is Turkey's largest trading partner. And this year, Turkey aims to pass its first climate law, which is a huge success. And so the post-COVID recovery is a crucial opportunity for Turkey to develop its own plan for transforming its energy system in line with new climate goals that it will develop, and for accelerating efforts for establishing a carbon pricing system within Turkey, for example. So, state and Europe can, make an impact by, just showing that it's possible by setting up goals by themselves, and not only for Europe, as we heard earlier, to make sure that we cut the carbon, but also, with the carbon border tax on imports, showing the world, hey, we do really care, and you need to change as well, to make sure that it's working. So if money, of course, always helps, I think. Then capacity development, going into countries which are not really able to make the changes by themselves, going on the ground, looking and working with organizations who are willing to make a change and are able to, feed in the policy processes of the given country. That will really help, like capacity development, not only capacity building, but look what's already there. And then make sure, that we transfer our knowledge, which we might gain in Germany already. We have gained in Germany already, to make sure that they profit from this knowledge as well, to actually make a change and show them it's possible. Because if we do not, as rather rich countries are able to do so, why would others, follow our path? If we are actually the most ones emitting CO2. So I think it's a mix of everything, but hope does help, of course, but it's not enough.
Yeah, naturally. And Tristan, another viewer asked, do you think that the best-in-class approach will offer enough incentive to change the whole market?
That has a bit to do with my personal belief, and I think yes, it does, because one reason why we founded ClimatePartner so many years ago was because we did not. We were seeing that regulation is not enough, or regulation is not fast enough to actually move the economy and businesses to change their behavior, or to move consumers to change their behaviors. That's why we said, well, let's set up a system where businesses can take climate action on a voluntary basis. And let's believe in the market mechanisms behind it, because if you are a best in class in moving forward and taking climate action, this will be hopefully potentially rewarded by consumers or by customers, no matter if it's consumers or other companies, actually buying products from you because you're best in class at taking climate action. Thank God this has really proven to be right. So we see that businesses that are taking best in class action there are showing the way of being the lighthouses of how to actually take climate action in business areas. And we're seeing that the consumers are voting by feet and actually moving towards buying products or supporting these businesses that are taking the right action. And this right away, of course, leads to competition, seeing this first best-in-class action and following suit. And that's just on the market side of things. If you look at countries, something like what Barbara said, if we're a country emitting, or as Europeans being among the top 3 carbon emitters, we're also among the top 3 most developed countries in the world that have already profited from industrialization, and we have sharp minds here that we should actually shift from thinking about how to build the next faster combustion engine car to how do I make a grid work and electric cars work. And if we do this in a best-in-class way, there will also be competition between countries. So if we see it already, if one single business in the US in the automotive industry, Tesla, has changed the way the whole German automotive industry and the whole world automotive industry thinks about electric vehicles. So they've actually shown, yes, it does work, and everybody says, oh my gosh, it looks like it is working. And so we have to change now too. And it had actually led to a domino effect into whole industries, into whole global industries across different countries. So I think it is a very good instrument to go down this path.
And Thomas, another viewer asked, how can we enable social and economic growth in developing countries and without fossil fuels? And alongside this, do you think developing countries are able to leapfrog technologies and, not use outdated technologies and go straight to the more innovative solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think not only can we help developing countries develop and grow without relying on fossil fuels, I think we should. And not just because it's good for the for the world and for the climate, but also because I think that I think someone earlier on was talking about short-term gains from investments in projects that might make sense today. The risks tied to those projects in terms of becoming stranded assets in the future are now very real. And in fact, we're seeing that a lot of countries that need to rely on the market to invest in, say, coal power plants are really struggling to find financiers that will back those projects, because it just doesn't make sense. I mean, in terms of the risks that these projects are exposed to in the future. So I think it's entirely possible, and in fact, it's the way that things are going. We're seeing that now. Having said that, it's not that simple, and maybe one of the aspects that I didn't answer to in the previous question on investing in renewables. Renewables get you part of the way, but they cannot answer all the needs of all sectors, right? There are hard to abate sectors like typically the cement, aluminium, some of these other large heavy industries that resort to that need high heat processes for which today's technologies cannot answer. And renewable energy cannot provide today a commercial solution to those needs. So I think one way, obviously, of supporting this transition in these developing countries is to help orient these projects and help support strategies for development of their energy sector that are future-looking and oriented towards renewables. And another way will be, and this is a problem we're all facing in developed countries, but will be investing in research and development for these other sectors that are today hard to abate and that do not have commercially viable solutions. I think I'll stop there.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but if you'd like to say some really brief parting words or main takeaway from today's session, starting with Barbara.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here, because I think it's a really interesting and important question on how to enable the just energy transition, not only in Germany, Europe, but worldwide. And I think it's a cumulative effort of most people and countries. And I think we have a starting point now, but it's really now, let's get back to business, make it work, not only for the developed countries, but also for the countries lacking still behind, rather because they do not have the resources yet, the knowledge, or because the political wise is still, not working in a way that, the government makes the necessary changes. So, I hope that, that we'll take this as a motivation to get the work done.
We do too. Tristan?
So I think what is a signal is that we need to invest into the right things. And how do I had a question and another discussion once that says, well, we as consumers, we can't change anything. We had an example before. Greta Thunberg changed the whole world as a 16-year-old girl. So yes, we can change things. And by simple consumer choices, if we do this collectively, we can actually change the way that businesses think and where the way investors think and where the money is actually invested into. And if we take this decision to have to buy products that are more sustainable, that are, say, carbon neutral products, for example, or organic products, businesses will start investing into more sustainable solutions, and that can really get the domino game spread out across the world. So yes, we can do something, and we should start doing something.
Absolutely. Thank you. And finally, Thomas.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting us. This has been really a fascinating discussion, and looking forward to seeing the rest of the gridX days. Look, I think, we've talked a lot about climate change. I think it's important to understand not just the changes, but the forces that are driving them. Climate change is ultimately a tragedy of the commons, and the solution has to go through collaboration. Collaboration is needed to invest in the right sectors, help economies that don't yet have the means to do so. It's also needed to solve some very complex problems like markets and subsidy reforms. And finally, to invest in research and development to create the solutions that today don't exist. So we need more of these talks and then action.
Agreed, definitely. Well, thank you all so much for your honest and open answers. There were some big topics discussed today, but I think we made some ground, and looking forward to more discussions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.